Hi, I'm Phyllis Lambert. I'm involved in How You Live in Cities. You're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Obscured by fear, and for many Japanese American citizens, forced relocation and imprisonment in American camps during World War II, Asian American architects survived to produce some of the most beautiful and still underappreciated architecture. Joining us today are returning podcast guest Takashi Yanai, partner at Ehrlich, Yanai, Rhee, and Chaney, and Mina Chow, filmmaker and architecture professor at USC and creator of the most delicious salads on Instagram. And now, like a spring mix with a dose of arugula with goat cheese, cranberries, candied pecans, vinaigrette, and not to be missed, smoked bacon bits, here's your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. That is a great introduction. And yes, if I were a salad, that would be the one. Because I love arugula. And of course, I love bacon. Sure, it's trendy, more expensive, and a bit elitist, or as they say in the UK, posh. It's one of those small luxuries that I know I don't need, but makes me happy every time anyway. And conversely, there are things that make me unhappy, but I keep doing anyway. I was that way with soda. Growing up, I drank gallons and gallons of Coke and Mountain Dew. The original recipe, not this corn syrup crap we have today. We're talking real sugar. If you're under 40, you probably have no idea how good that original formula is. The soda companies started monkeying around with corn syrup as a sweetener in the 80s and have never gone back. If you'll Google old Coke versus new Coke, you can get some of the history. But as we all know, consuming quantities of soda in any form is bad for you. It packs on the pounds, it plays with your blood sugar. But if you want to taste the arugula of sodas, head on down to your neighborhood Mexican tienda.
Yeah.
Most in the U.S. sell Coke and sometimes Mountain Dew, still made with sugar in Mexico and other countries and exported here. This blissful beverage pairs delightfully with goat cheese, cranberries, candied pecans, vinaigrette, and bacon bits. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Architect Takashi Yanai is a partner at Ehrlich, Yanai, Rhee, and Chaney Architects, also known as EYRC. He works in the LA office where he is director of both the Los Angeles and San Francisco residential studios. After graduating from Santa Monica High School,
Go Vikings!
And UC Berkeley,
Go Golden Bears!
He started out working in Tokyo as a journalist for GA Houses, one of the most beautiful architecture magazines in the world. His firm, EYRC, is a rock star, with modernist houses all around California over the last 40 years. Welcome, Takashi.
Thank you, guys. Happy to be here.
Returning podcast guest Mina Chow has a BA in architecture from UC Berkeley.
More Golden Bears, yay!
And a master's in architecture from Harvard.
Go Crimson.
She's founding principal of MC2 Spaces, and I first met Mina in 2017 at the debut of her stunning documentary, Face of a Nation, What Happened to the World's Fair, a movie everyone should see to better understand America's role in world diplomacy. Mina is an architect who has served on award-winning teams responsible for representing American architecture in the global arena, including the State Department, where in 2022 she was on the scene at the Dubai World's Fair. And in her spare time, she's an adjunct professor at USC.
Go Trojans!
And serves up the most amazing salads on Instagram. Mina, the last time we spoke to you, it was about your documentary on World's Fairs and how influential those environments can be on people's imaginations. We know the United States has not been showing up very well internationally. How much does architecture mean in terms of the world stage?
I think that it probably needs to be more on people's mind how important it is. If you're talking about the design community, we are obsessed with architecture. However, I would say that the rest of the public doesn't understand the power and influence of the language of architecture and how it can persuade. I think that throughout the history of human civilization, people of influence and power have always recognized this language and its ability to connect to people through the sensory dimensions, the visionary power of radical architectural engineering, as well as its ability to touch people on a personal level. So I would imagine, short answer to your question is not as much as I would like.
And Takashi, before we dive into architecture today, I just wanted to ask about your experience with GA houses. I think most of the public does not know this magazine. It's not as well known to the general public as, say, Architecture Record or Dwell, but I've seen it. I have a lot of copies of it in my house. It is kind of the Architects magazine. It's just exquisite.
Yeah, thank you. It was at the time, so we're going back in the time machine like 30 years, maybe the preeminent international architectural journal. I remember the first GA I bought was at Taliesin West, and it was at Frank Lloyd Wright's houses, Prairie Houses in Illinois. So yeah, it was a great time working at GA. Everyone, just about anyone coming through Japan at the time would come through our offices. And I, being one of the few native English speakers, was lucky enough to always be in the room, albeit, it was to fetch cups of coffee and things like that. But I got to rub elbows with the who's who in architecture back in those days. I got a very skewed idea of what it would be like to be an architect. And I think that's what drew me back to the profession, actually.
And it's really interesting to look through what's featured in the early GA Houses magazines, because a number of the projects were never published in the U.S. at all. It's kind of like Sylvester Stallone would do vodka commercials in Russia, but not back in the U.S.
Right, yeah. If you go back, there are lots of things you would never expect, like Bill Stout of Bill Stout Books, for instance, is an architect, and he was roommates with Stephen Hall. So there's some early Bill Stout buildings in the early GA houses. There's a lot of stuff on the Santa Monica School. So that's what we used to call all these star architects from Los Angeles before they're star architects. So that's like Frank Gehry and Tom Main and Eric Owen Moss, et cetera, back when they were kids just out of grad school. So that was interesting to see how they were able to sort of pick up on these people who would become legends eventually in the US and Europe. And it was also a gateway the other way. So when we published monographs on Tadao Ando or Isozaki or Toyo Ito, for these eventual Pritzker Prize winning architects, they were debuts to a Western audience.
Mina, you and Takashi spoke together at Modernism Week 2023 on Asian American architects and their influence and legacy and current presence in the architecture scene. Tell me a little bit about that presentation. What did you open up with?
Well, when Francis and Alan asked us to present some of these untold stories, which was the title of the talk, I remember when I was a student at it's called Harvard Graduate School of Design. We call it the GSD. Both Takashi and I, we call it the GSD. So when we were students in architecture, we always probably wondered whatever happened to some of these other examples of architects that, like Asian architects that may have had some influence. And, we all heard of I.M. Pei, and I actually have a family connection to I.M. Pei, but these untold stories are now more important than ever. So the way I started it was Francis asked me if I could surprise the audience with somebody. So I brought the guy that I talked about, Miller Fong, who I'd known for almost 20 years. He had been at USC teaching some sketchbook classes, and I didn't know myself how much of an impact his work had had on American culture and history. His work is in the LACMA permanent collection, and a lot of people didn't know his story. And I didn't know his story when I first met him, and I could not believe how little I knew. And so we brought him after I told this story of his rags to riches from his father, starting out literally without even a high school graduation, coming to the United States really, really with nothing, and going back to China to get married and bringing his family back to the United States and turning what historically and in terms of materials exploration was considered a cheap material and making it an incredibly valued material in modernist furniture design. I just had to do that. So then we actually, after I did my presentation, I mentioned Miller was in the audience and he got a standing ovation. So that's how I started.
Oh, nice, nice. And Takashi, what did you talk about there?
Well, let's see. When Francis and Ellen asked me to do this, I was really sort of honored, of course, but scratching my head what to dive into. I myself am an Asian American architect, yes, but I was actually born in Japan. And so for a person of Japanese descent, I actually don't share a lot of that sort of family history with what you would normally associate with being Japanese American in this country. On the other hand, Isamu Noguchi, the sculptor, artist, almost architect, Isamu Noguchi had always been sort of a guiding light for me from the time I was very young, perhaps middle school or high school, in how he spent his career, life and career, sort of navigating between two cultures and maybe existentially through his work, sort of exploring the relationship between the two cultures in a very, very personal way. And I had known, not as a scholar, but just by being a fan of his work and his biography, that he had spent some time in internment. But it wasn't really until I was asked to do this talk that I looked into it a little bit. So that's what I ended up talking about. And it was sort of interesting, the things I discovered and the things that had never occurred to me about his journey. Noguchi was already an established up-and-coming artist at the time. And just a small footnote, he had just been awarded, I think by Herman Miller, but maybe it was even before Herman Miller, this commission to design this collapsible coffee table, which became in the end like the iconic Noguchi table. But this was right at the beginning of the war, World War II, and certainly before internment. So when internment happened, he was sort of shielded from this. He was working in New York, so this executive order did not apply to those on the East Coast. And he was a celebrity artist that had protections through people he knew, including people in the government. But he saw this as an opportunity to show solidarity, one, but also somewhat naively, an opportunity to create experimentally a utopia in one of these camps, relocation camps or internment camps. And so he voluntarily interned himself at Potsdam in Arizona. He jumped in his truck, closed up his studio, jumped in a truck, drove out to Arizona and walked on in, starting a voluntary internment, which in very short order turned into a real internment. But he always enjoyed a little bit, I don't know if enjoy is the word, but he always was in a place of some privilege. And the other internees sort of viewed him with a little bit of suspicion.
Like he was a spy, maybe.
Maybe, or that, yeah, who was this guy? Because clearly he had a relationship with the bureaucracy, those in charge, that they didn't have. And he had these lofty ideas. He probably did not exhibit the bitterness that most of the others would have. And I read, and I don't have it in front of me, unfortunately, but I read an ironic letter that he had written to Man Ray, a friend of his, describing the scene at Potsdam and how desolate it was and how he was discouraged, blah, blah, blah. But that it was interesting what he was up to and that Man Ray should come visit, as if, he had just moved to a new environment. And, he was just asking his friend to come on over and say hi.
That's bizarre.
But very shortly, he was somewhat disillusioned and left, organized his departure. Took him a while because once interned, he was an internee. And not much came of his time in internment, but I think over time, that experience and his time spent in the desert had a huge influence on his work, whether consciously or subconsciously. And I think that is a field that is sort of very ripe to be mined, to be sort of examined. And that was the gist of my talk. And after that, it's been on my mind how these things, similar to what Mina was talking about with Miller, how these things are just happening. These are things that just happen within the course of your life. And as a result of your particular place and the particular time, and how these things influence you and manifest themselves are not maybe ever truly understood, but it's great to shine a light upon them. And hence, I think this whole idea of the stories untold is very, very important.
HOK is one of the largest architecture firms in the world, but a lot of people outside of the architecture field don't know that the O in HOK stands for Gio Obata, who just died last year at almost 100. Tell us about him.
Well, again, I'm not a scholar. I'm not an expert. I do believe that he spent some time in Berkeley teaching as well. So Gil Obata was similar to I.M. Pei, was a figure there. And there were others, these predecessors, Asian American architects who worked and earned a high level of respect and notoriety and accomplishment in the U.S.
You're thinking like of Yamasaki?
Yamasaki, yes. Yamasaki.
Minoru
exactly.
Yamasaki, okay.
Yes. Working in St. Louis, I was just in St. Louis. I was giving a little talk at the AIA St. Louis Awards event. And it's amazing, the legacy of HOK. We don't think about HOK that much anymore. Just like we don't think about I.M. Pei as much as we should anymore. But there have been these sort of forefathers that have left this great legacy for us. And it's odd, though, that once they achieve a level of success, we sometimes cease to think of them as other or Asian American. They become part of the canon, which is great in some respects. But I think in other respects, it's important to recognize where an individual comes from and try to understand how that cultural seed and also, personal and family histories have had great impacts on their careers and therefore the architecture.
George, do you mind if I pipe in real quick?
Yes, please go ahead and pipe.
A lot of what Takashi was saying, I just wanted to remark upon a couple of things I noticed that was maybe totally random why you selected us to talk, but it's interesting because Noguchi was a known entity, and yet the Fong brothers and their furniture company was not necessarily as known, but they were becoming known. And then some of the things he brought up, it's like, we don't know a lot of these stories, and they do need to be told because, this country is a country of immigrants. And in order to feel connected to this world, we need to hear these stories because there are people that came before us that did have an impact on the creation of a lot of things that we didn't really know about. Actually, when Takashi was talking about Noguchi and the internment camps, I didn't know that, he was somewhat ostracized by his own people because they thought he was a celebrity. And then the stories that I told, a lot of people didn't know that a lot of the stuff that was happening in mid-century modernism with the adoption of a lot of the defense plants after World War II, going into the housing industry, how people like Eames were taking some of these new industries and adapting them to make more affordable housing. Miller Fong's father, Danny Ho Fong, was using the same process to create more affordable furniture. So I think that these stories are really, really important. I just wanted to mention that.
Mina and Takashi, what are some books that people could read about Asian American architects? Have there been some good ones in the last couple of years, either about a single person or about an array of Asian Americans?
That's a tough question because I myself am working on creating a series right now that are focusing. It's a docu-series on some of these Asian American architects. I have folders. If I'm looking at my file folder, Helen Liu Fong, Fong brothers, who I talked about, Eugene Choi, Gilbert Leung, George Shino, Ken Nishimoto, Kazumo Adachi, Frank Sada, Hideo Matsunaga, Edward Takashi, Jin Wang, Daisuke Nagano, all of these people. And I am looking for books and I am looking for articles. And it has not been easy.
So what you do is you sell the book rights to the docuseries that you're making.
Yeah.
Then you double dip.
Well, yesterday I was on the phone with John English because I am literally I'm actually turning this, what I call the absence of presence or the presence of absence. We don't have enough documented on these people. I'm sure there are a couple of books that are out. I did see something. What's happening right now is there are people like me and Takashi and others who are going into deep research to start to create anthologies about some of these architects and designers. But it takes a lot of funding and it takes a lot of material resources. And Takashi has a job. He has to run his office. I have a job. I have to teach my students. And we're doing this optionally. We're doing this extra time, we have to take away from our kids or our families in order to be able to do this. So there are a couple of books here and there, obviously on Noguchi. Noguchi, definitely Noguchi. By the way, I have a good Noguchi coffee table, and I just got my Eames chair repaired. But a lot of these unknown ones, there's just not that many out there, and they're just starting the deep research process to turn them into literary sources. I
also think, the two books that, and I'm looking at them. So I have a mini library of Noguchi books and then a couple IMA books. But these books, as wonderful as they are not necessarily written through the lens of their experiences as Asian Americans. Not that is the sole defining factor in their careers and in the architecture, but it is a factor. And interestingly, I know we're talking about Asian American architects, but I think especially being on the West Coast, especially modernism, mid-century modernism, there's a lot here that has been influenced by Asian architecture, not necessarily Asian architects, but Asian architecture as well. And there's some scholarship on that and mention of that, or maybe it's observation that a Neutra house is mindful of Katsura. But there are deeper stories there as well. When I go to the Mack Center, the Schindler House, the King's Road house that, at least in Los Angeles, many of us point to as sort of the ground zero of modernism in California. To me, there's deep influence. It can't just be coincidence. Maybe it is Asian influence in that architecture, but there's no scholarship around it. There might be a mention of it, or someone notices something, a similarity, and makes that comparison, but there's no real scholarship around it. I think that is also an area that has a lot to offer in terms of understanding this dialogue between cultures, especially around the Pacific Ocean.
John Winship also put together a document. She was also on the panel for Modernism Week. And she did this post-war Japanese American architects map of certain projects. And, there's little pieces here and there, but you're absolutely right, Takashi. There's just not enough. And there needs to be a huge push. I've been applying for grants, but so far I haven't won any. And it's hard because I have to fund it myself.
We have two Asian American architects to offer up for further study. We've done a little bit of work on each one. George Matsumoto, who our Matsumoto Prize is named after here, taught at NC State and then spent the rest of his career in California. And someone more obscure, Aji Tashiro, who worked in a little tiny town in the North Carolina mountains. He was a basketball star in his early career, designed houses in the Cincinnati area, and then moved to North Carolina, where he spent the rest of his life. And it has been fun and just fascinating to study these two guys' projects and track them down and make sure that they're still standing. And it's good news that in most cases, their work is still around.
Yeah, George, I've actually always been curious about Matsumoto and the origins of that prize being called the Matsumoto Prize. So, yes, I would be very much interested in learning more about him. I mean, part of my comments earlier, so I know there's no camera, but I'm sitting in a Gregory Ain house in the Mar Vista tract in Los Angeles. So it's 52 mid-century modern houses. And what makes this neighborhood, one of the things that makes it appealing, well, Gregory Ain, first of all, he was the project architect for Neutra on the Level Health House. He was inspired by Schindler, so very much of that legacy. But the landscape architect for this neighborhood was Garrett Ekbo. And it has a certain sort of Japanese landscape vibe. And it turns out that he had spent some time in Japan studying landscape architecture. And that's something that I was never aware of until, I was fortunate enough to acquire this house not that long ago. So yes, there are all these little wonderful stories about these sorts of backs and forths between Western and Eastern, or between California and Asian architecture.
I just wanted to mention that when we were judging it, I looked him up because I felt like we had to judge the submissions based off of what Matsumoto valued. Since his work was known for simplicity, rigor, and residential interpretation to the international style, he studied under Ilya Saarinen. He was influenced by Gropius and Mies, Catalano, and Buckminster Fuller. He also went to UC Berkeley. There seems to be some Cal Bear connection. But he was interned in an internment camp after Berkeley. And he also graduated Cranbrook. He collaborated with civil engineer contractor Frank Walser. So, I just learned about him myself. I thought it was pretty cool to learn about some of these people I didn't know anything about. And, a lot of what we're doing is we're learning about these people because we feel like we don't know enough ourselves. So I would encourage your audience that if they're curious about something, that's usually how problems are solved. As I tell my students, you're the one that needs to be finding the answers. Don't rely on others to do it if you want the answers yourself.
Mina Takashi, thank you so much for spending time talking about this. I hope to see your presentation live sometime in the future and learn more about Asian American architects. Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Los Angeles, Toronto, Palm Springs, and Malibu. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Kelly Policelli heads up guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guyout. George and I will be back soon with another full-fiber, nutritious, salad-based edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Bacon, bacon, bacon.